the snow's turned to water. Christmas days have come and gone. Broken toys and faded colors are all that's left to linger on. I hate graveyards and old pawn shops, for they always bring me tears. I can't forgive the way they robbed me of the childhood souvenirs. Memories that can't be bought, can't be won at carnivals for free. Well, it took me years to get those souvenirs, and don't know how they slipped away from me.
All right, guys. Hello, and hope you all are having a great night. It is me, Symoné Crockett, your hostess with the mostest, or as my friend Austin Folksy Davis would say, hostess with the samostest. Might as well start using that because it's pretty catchy. But you're here for Tales Behind the Creative. Tonight is going to be episode number 7. I have Robert Hass who's going to be on the show tonight. I'm very excited to talk to him. He's a local poet in the local Erie community. So tonight should be an interesting time. Of course, we're here to spread the love, the positivity, good vibes. So I hope you guys enjoy. Of course, yet again, we're on Facebook Live, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to pull up and ask me, and I will ask him. In the meantime, though, I'm going to get him pulled up on the screen. We're going to get this party started, have a good time, so you guys enjoy the show. All right, let's bring him in. Hello, how are you?
Good.
Good.
See ya.
Welcome to Tales Behind the Creative. I'm glad you could come on tonight.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here. It's a great show.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Just trying to get out here and spread the good vibes and love during these very trying and negative times that we have going on right now.
And look how important art is, more now than ever.
Seriously, though. And it sucks that we have to miss on it, you know, in the face-to-face realm, but at least we have the virtual technology to make it a possibility this way. So it works out.
That's cool. So,
right.
So how's everything going? How's the response been?
Everything has been awesome, honestly. I just started my new page today for Tales Behind the Creative on Facebook, so you guys can pull up on that. But everyone is really excited about it. The more, every night that keeps coming, the more viewers that I keep accumulating, and the more requests that I keep getting for guests to keep coming on the show. So it's been an incredible turnout, and I couldn't be more excited and grateful for it, honestly.
Such a great idea. Perfect timing, great idea. Right. Kudos to you.
So. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. So let's go ahead and get this party started. Okay. Why don't you go ahead and tell me and everyone else a little bit more about yourself for everyone who doesn't already know you?
Okay, well, I'm a professor at Edinboro. I teach English literature and creative writing at Edinboro. I've been there for about 19 years now.
Okay.
I'm also a literary critic, so I'm both a scholar and a poet. I kind of do things on both sides of the equation.
That's awesome.
My scholarship tends to focus on 20th century poetry and modern poetry, and especially the poetry of Robert Frost. I wrote a book on Robert Frost. I'm co-editing the letters of Robert Frost for Harvard with one of my colleagues at Edinboro and 2 colleagues who are teaching and working in Japan, actually. So it's kind of a nice international team. It's a labor of love. It's a lot of work, I'll tell you.
Right. I can imagine.
6 volumes. We're just finishing volume 3 right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And how many more volumes do you have to go?
Well, 3, I think. At this point, I think 3.
Okay, so you're on the last one then.
I mean, these come in at about 185,000 words apiece. So
Whew,
yeah, they're thick books. So
right. My goodness, taking up a lot of space in the bookshelf, that's for
yeah,
sure.
no kidding. Solid bookshelf to hold them, that's for sure. So,
Right, awesome.
yeah.
Well, how did you get into this type of field?
Well, I guess I'm one of the few people who knew at a very young age that what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to be a poet probably from about the age of 10, I
Yeah,
think. And I don't know. I mean, sometimes the art chooses you instead of you choosing the art.
right,
Uh, Maybe it was because, like all of us, I read Dr. Seuss and, you
right,
know, children's books, and I was fascinated by rhyme and, of course, the fantasy and the pictures of all of those youthful children's poetry books. And something about that early education in poetry, probably in about second grade, fired my imagination. And
right.
then I started writing poems, and I actually hid them from my parents. And my
Really?
mom found them stashed under my mattress one day, and shared them with my father. And of course, they were gracious and grateful and encouraging. So even though both of my parents were scientists, they never dissuaded me from pursuing a love of the humanities. So, which was kind of very interesting.
Right, that is.
So they were wonderful in that regard. And
That's good.
yeah, they weren't that, I think there are a lot of contemporary parents out there right now who, suppose, Simone, you've told your mom, I really want to not be an accountant. I'm changing my major to
Right.
poetry.
Yeah.
Now you
Like,
can imagine that sort of thing.
what
It
did you
doesn't
do
go
with poetry?
over my head. So you're going to live in my basement for the rest of your
Right, exactly.
life. So, but my parents were the opposite. They encouraged me. They loved literature, and you know, I'm grateful that they did encourage me. So,
Right.
and then it's just kind of I majored in English as an undergraduate,
Okay.
then got a master's degree at the University of Florida, where I studied with a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, and then went back to Penn State
Wow.
for PhD. So in literature. So
Okay.
I was a student for a long time.
Right. Well, sometimes it's the longer the better. The more knowledge that you obtain in the field and the better that you come out in your profession at the end of the day. So it kind of works out.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. I had some wonderful teachers and people who loved what they were teaching, people who were invested in students and, shared that love and enthusiasm. They were kind of boundless in their energy and affirmation of what they did,
Right.
which I hope I can kind of translate that same enthusiasm into my own profession. So.
Right, exactly. I can imagine the students probably love you. You seem like a pretty cool teacher to me, so.
Well, I hope, yeah, not every.
You want to keep your fingers crossed, right?
You can please some people some of the time. Yeah, I don't know. I think for the most part, I think people think I'm earnest, if not somewhat a little demanding and scolding at times and so forth. But,
Well, that's what any good teacher has to do at certain points. You can't be the nice teacher all the time, you know?
no, yeah, it's a fine line between coddling somebody and really trying to push those artists, those writers forward
Right,
as they're learning their own voice and craft. And that's a big key,
right,
And, there's never anything completely wrong with the student draft. And sometimes there are drafts that just blow you away. So
right,
you kind of find a way to rationally critique the work that you're seeing and bring in other literature as examples and so forth. So you
right,
rely on your knowledge of tradition to try and show students how other poets have solved different kinds of problems before.
right. Right. And so you're still conducting online classes then, I would figure, like most of all the other teachers that are dealing with the loss of having face-to-face classes now with the whole pandemic, right?
Right. All Edinboro is online now. And
Right.
I'm fortunate because I just happened to schedule a sabbatical for
Okay.
this semester. So I wasn't teaching at all. I'm just actually staying at home and writing. And
Okay.
and working on other research projects, finishing up volume 3 of the letters and so forth.
Right.
So it's just, it's the second sabbatical that I've had in 19 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, it's lovely,
Well deserved.
well, you have time to think and time to write and without some of the other distractions of your professional and daily life.
Right.
It's a welcome respite. So,
Yes. I like that. I like that.
yeah.
So do you have a favorite poet by chance?
Wow. I mean, there's so many that I love.
Top 3.
Oh my God. Well, I have to say Shakespeare is probably number one.
Okay.
I mean, I teach Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. The problem with teaching Shakespeare is you realize just how every poet after Shakespeare is just a kind of falling off of that genius,
Right.
I never tire of it. Whenever I read even the same text again and again, I see something new that's worthy of loving and admiring, and
Right.
just fabulous. So Shakespeare is one. I'm really fond of a Roman poet named Virgil,
Okay.
uh, who was in some ways the state poet of the Emperor Augustus. And
Oh.
yeah, he wrote the Aeneid, which was one of the really, really important epic poems for the Renaissance in terms of how to fashion a virtuous civic life. And he wrote another collection called the Georgics, which, is sort of a book about farming. And I grew up in the country.
Okay.
It was a book that spoke to me when I was young, and I never read it in the original Latin. I only read it in translation. But it's really about a model of how to live close to the land, live a virtuous life, respect and think about your position in nature, your boundaries within nature, and so forth.
Right.
And so having grown up with a father who was a biochemist who took us out into the natural world from the time we were very little,
Yeah.
that spoke a lot to me. Robert Frost, I think, is great. Emily Dickinson is fabulous.
Yes, I like both of them actually.
And Wordsworth, I love. There are too many to mention. I think.
Right.
Some really great contemporary poets. I'm really fond of a contemporary poet who's living in Greece right now named Alicia Stallings.
Okay.
Very witty, smart, incredibly gifted poet. So there are many. So
Right. There's there's a lot to go around for sure. Everyone has a different take with their poetry, so I can imagine there's just way too many to keep up with.
kind of like asking to choose who your favorite child is. You can't really do that.
Very tough question to answer. Like, let me narrow down. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
That's yeah.
So, kind of getting to the serious take of what's going on around us in this world. What is your take on the whole COVID-19 pandemic that's upon us right now?
Well, it's not the first time that we've been beset by plagues in history. Of course, if you read literature or even read the Bible, for example, you know that there are various plagues affecting civilizations through different times. Shakespeare himself, for example, lived during a time of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, where
Right.
the pandemic was killing people at a much higher rate than our pandemic is now. But the response is really the same throughout history. A kind of lack of awareness, a sort of shock that it's all happening, a reluctance to address the problem quickly enough.
Right.
And then, the inevitable hunkering down and social distancing and quarantining oneself so that one doesn't become inflicted by the pandemic that's upon us. Of course, the human tragedy is the same.
Right.
Lots of people dying, children dying, especially during the bubonic plague. I mean, you can stop and think about how people were ostracized in the leper colonies in antiquity and so forth. So disease and plague have been with us for a long time, and we kind of chug along with our daily lives, not recognizing that the natural world is full of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as Shakespeare says. And, these are things that can inflict great damage upon human populations. And we are sort of shocked when we see them.
Right.
I think on a positive note, I mean, you want to think about the positive. I mean, one of the things that I like about this is that it's forcing us to look at art, stay at home, maybe sit around the piano and play music, read books. We're not distracted by a lot of trivia. I mean, there are no sports to watch, for example,
Right.
even though I love sports.
Yeah.
I'm not just turning on the television to watch a sporting match of some sort. And in my own neighborhood, I see families walking together, walking their dogs together. And there's a kind of close-knit union that we've always had, but now we're seeing in a kind of, I want to say, increased manner, where we're really beginning to pay attention to one another, appreciating the fragility of life, spending lots of time with the people that we love and cherish. And I think that's in many ways a great benefit.
Right.
So
I can very much agree with that. I'm really grateful, as much as I want to be outside and be around all my other friends, it's been really nice to kind of just take a break to, be with myself and then be with the family as well. It's something that we all truly need in our very busy schedules that we have any other day when something like this isn't going on. So.
And it is fearful too. I mean, people your age probably have less to worry about than people my age, and I have less to worry about than people who are older than I am, for example.
Exactly.
And so the older you are, I would think the more fretful you are about the possibility of contracting the virus and then the effect it might have on you. Because we know that the rates of mortality differ depending on how old one is. And,
right.
So you're all young and invincible.
Right. For the most part. Let's knock on wood here.
Yeah, but don't let that invincibility make you do stupid things, right? That's, so
right.
You still have to consider yourself a vector for the virus, even if you show no symptoms,
Right.
So it forces us to think outside of ourselves and think of other people. And that's such a bad thing. In an age of narcissism, which I think our age really is.
Yeah, I agree.
Thinking outside of yourself and thinking about community is a really, really important thing. So I think it's a good benefit.
Yeah, I like it. Like I like to say a lot, it's a curse, but at the same time, it's a beautiful blessing at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's all about how you think about it. Perspective is key in this time.
Well, that's right. I mean, so it's a mixed feeling, I think, that a lot of people have. I mean, we're nervous, we're fretful. I think we're horrified by some of the suffering that we see. We're grateful that we aren't. But we're also pulling together, coming together as a community, thinking about other people, rekindling the family unit in a way, or reviving the family unit
Yeah.
in ways that are important. And I think that's all positive. So,
Agreed. Very much so.
yeah.
So I know you were talking about you were doing a lot of writing. Is there anything else that you're kind of doing to pass the way in a positive light during this time?
Well, I have a puppy, and I take long walks
Yay!
the game lands, and
Okay.
so it's a great opportunity to spend a lot of time in nature. Nature is always a place of healing and spiritual sustenance for me, great beauty. And today, for example, the forest floor was carpeted in a little wildflower called Claytonia, whose common name is spring beauty. And
Okay.
really beautiful little four-petaled flowers. And I was out with my dog looking for wild leeks so I could harvest some wild leeks and
Okay.
make a wild leek and ham and cheese quiche out of them.
Ooh, that
And
sounds
so,
delicious.
so I was searching in an area where I had never searched for them before, but after the 3rd mile of hiking today on a beautiful day,
So
I
nice.
found more than I needed and harvested just a few and took them home and came home. So
Awesome.
that's one positive thing that I do. And I usually take the binoculars with me and look at birds and look at
Right.
flowers and take pictures and just watch the puppy run off leash.
Yes.
And watching a dog liberated from the house and his leash is just to watch pure unbridled joy. I mean,
Seriously though.
it really is. And beautiful to watch the athleticism of a dog.
Yes. You're just like, how do you have so much energy?
And the optimism and the just sheer ebullience, the just pure joy. And my dog is still pretty young. He's 2
Okay.
years old. And
Oh yeah, still pretty much in the puppy mode for sure.
he chooses the biggest obstacles that he can possibly run through, and I just love watching, so.
Well, good. I'm glad you're taking the time to get out there and, do some healthy activity and just take in the nature, because there's nothing better than that. That's for sure. People kind of forget about nature sometimes when everything else is going around. So it's good to go outside and smell the roses, per se.
That's exactly right. And they'll be coming, so. One of
Exactly.
the ironies is that, spring is flourishing and blooming with
Right.
all beauty in the midst of a pandemic. So, how do you reconcile the cherry trees blossoming with what you're seeing?
Exactly. It's
So,
quite a, pull and tear. Like it's crazy how it's all going on, but
mhm.
hopefully it'll all be over soon. Fingers crossed for us. So, have you come up with any new inspirations, techniques, or any new projects while you've been stuck at the house?
Well, I mean, the context of the coronavirus does kind of force you to think about your own moment. And,
Right.
I mean, poets can write about history, they can write about historical figures, they can imagine what life might be like in the future. There's no prescription for it. But I think I admire poets who try to address the realities of the moment they're in. And so thinking about the ironies and the difficulties and sometimes the suffering of others inspires some work. And I may read a poem that came out of the COVID for you
Okay.
at the show. Otherwise, since I've been on sabbatical, I mean, when people ask me what I do for a living, I basically say, well, I stare out the window, sitting in my chair, and chant to myself, because as I'm composing, I'm constantly reciting lines out loud. so I
Right.
can hear them, so I can hear the rhythm of the line.
Right.
And so there are these long moments where you just sort of look into nothing because you're imagining the poem, or you're hearing the poem, or you're
Right.
jostling words in your head and then writing them down, and then reading your poem to yourself, and then revising, and then scrapping parts of it, and then redoing it. So I don't know that the process for me has changed.
Right.
But there are different processes that one uses all the time. So, for example, one poem that I wrote this semester or this spring kind of came to me early in the morning, when you're in that sort of half awake, half sleeping
Yeah.
state, and
Right.
suddenly an idea hits you. And so I actually just woke up and started writing lines down on my iPhone notebook, so
Okay.
so I wouldn't forget them, and
Right. Right.
kept going. And then when I got up, I continued. There are other times when I have an idea and it takes me days to write, 12 lines of poetry because I'm trying to get it right. So sometimes poems come spontaneously, sometimes you sort of will them through the hard work of craft.
Right. Right.
So it happens both ways. So I guess what I'm suggesting is sometimes you're inspired, but the best writers write when they're not inspired, when you have to kind
Right.
of flog the muse yourself and kind of will yourself into the creative act. So you can't just say, oh, well, I haven't been inspired, therefore I'm going to be lazy,
Right. True. Very true. I agree with that.
Or I have writer's block, so
Right.
maybe I'll just eat a pizza,
Right. Call myself guilty. I've done that a few times myself.
So sometimes you just have to stay with it and keep going, even in those moments when the muse is not biting you, so to speak. So
Right. I like it. Those are good words of advice right there. Just got to keep prevailing, even though you might be stuck in a moment.
and these are my experiences, but I'm sure that other poets compose differently. Some people put a first draft down and then they go back to it and they revise it 1,000 times. I have a tendency to revise as I write.
Right.
There's no right or wrong way to do it. I mean,
Right.
everyone works differently.
There's a method to everyone's madness, per se.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, have you found any challenges by chance in the writing process or any other process in your personal or creative life during this time?
Um, I think the biggest challenge is how to be authentic always,
Right.
and to, think about how you're interpreting the world in a way that seems truthful both to yourself and to your readers. I mean, that's always the goal, I think. That sense of sincerity, and then making sure that that sincerity is embedded in beautiful language,
Right.
and language that's musical and rhythmical and meaningful. Um, I tend to think that the poet's first obligation is not to oneself, but to the reader. I think it should be a process of reaching out. And I think a lot of poets, at least poets as they're beginning, think that it's a way of sort of, expressing one's particular pain, one's particular experience, one's particular view of life. And in some ways that's true. But the key is to make that experience and the expression of that experience meaningful to somebody else. The everyday life of you is not enough. Your common humanity is not enough for me to care about your poem. I
Right.
want that you, as a poet, are caring for me as a reader. So I want there to be a merging of writer and reader, a coming together of human beings, so that people realize that there are shared experiences, that there are universal insights that we can find even as we're expressing private experiences or ideas.
Right.
But I always think there's that fine line between a kind of solipsism, a self-reflectivity, and using the personal experience to reach out. And so I'm always trying to suggest in my poetry, or at least I try to anyway, that what I'm saying is not just meaningful to me, but is meaningful and relevant to you.
Yes.
So I think, I think that's always one of the great challenges of writing poetry. And taking care of language,
Right.
As Eliot says, the poet's first obligation is to language.
Right.
And, you have to love words. You have to think about using words well. This is your medium. It's a beautiful medium for making art.
Right. So, I like that.
How does that sound? I mean,
that was very well put. That was beautiful, honestly. That felt like a poem in itself, that answer.
Yeah. It's, and again, that's me, I don't want to say that this is how one should do things. Everyone has a different method or a reason or a rationale. I think of a poet like Sylvia Plath, for example, a mid-century poet who was bipolar and struggled immensely with her mental health, and oftentimes wrote poems to keep herself here and alive and meaningful and purposeful. And so I don't know, for example, how long Sylvia Plath would have survived had she not written poetry.
Right.
Poems extended her life for a long, long time. I think longer than she herself even envisioned. So that may be another purpose for someone writing poetry, just as an example.
Right.
So it's I guess my reasons are wanting to connect, to reach out, to inhabit, or to allow people to inhabit worlds that they would never inhabit were they not reading literature.
Right. And I agree. I mean, it's been a while since I've done poetry. Probably the last time I've actually done any form of poetry was for a friend's birthday recently that just passed. And I did a really long, like 2-page poem. And it really took me forever to kind of think about it, because I was just like, I want this to be good from my perspective, but from their perspective as well, because it's a pair and share type of relationship when it comes to any type of writing, even when it comes to writing articles for the Erie Reader. I mean, I'm always looking out for my audience at the end of the day, because I want to make sure that they're going to be interested and want to read it. So I can completely understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you think about your audience. I think you have an obligation to think about your audience and cultivate a style that will allow you to reach your audience as best you can. But the interesting thing is the impulse is, I think, innate.
Yes.
We want to create. We want to reach out. I don't know of a single human being who has not tried to write a poem, who has not tried to sing a song, who has not tried to draw a painting or a picture. No matter how good or bad it is, we have these urges, and these urges are important. Some of us refine those urges a little bit better than others, but there's something innate about the creative process that makes us intrinsically human.
Yes. Very much agree. So what would be one of the best things and one of the worst things that you've taken away from this whole pandemic?
The best thing. Well, I think the best thing is that I'm seeing people coming together in ways that we may not have expected. You know, my sister is a cardiologist and an internal medicine doctor in Colorado. And she's treating patients in a pandemic. I mean, she's got to go in
Right, right.
to people who are having cardiac emergencies. And, you know, it's hard, it's difficult enough to do that job
Right.
under normal circumstances.
Right, agreed, yes.
But when I see her administering care to her patients, you know, putting on all of the necessary armor to protect herself
Right,
and going in day after day and treating these patients because she has a calling to do so,
right.
a moral duty to do so. And I think about all of these unsung heroes
Yes.
who are on the front lines. I mean, from the grocery store clerk to the first responders to the EMTs to the nurses. God bless the nurses
Yes. Our hearts go out to them. They are amazing.
who are working, you know, ungodly hours
Yes.
each week without a break, you know, without the necessary equipment in some cases, and devoting themselves to the well-being of others.
Right.
So I, you know, I am heartened by that kind of response.
Yeah.
And I, you know, during times of crises, you know, we see both the best of human nature and sometimes we see the worst of human nature. It's never one or the other only.
Right.
And, but we're seeing a lot of the best of human beings come together. You know, when I think about Italy, for example, and I
Right.
think how disastrous the pandemic has been for that country, and I see these Italian opera singers singing arias off their balconies to try and
So
calm.
beautiful.
It's beautiful. You know, it's that reaching out, that extension of care towards somebody else. So I would say that that is the best that I've seen.
Okay.
The worst that I've seen is sort of, you know, in some ways reflective of the narcissism and vulgarity of our age, where some people are placing profits ahead of human life,
Yes, yes.
where we're not responding to the needs of people the way that we should. And, you know, we're living in a kind of political milieu with such distressing partisanship that we seem to have forgotten that people who are on the other side of the aisle are human beings too.
Yes.
I mean, I can't imagine, for example, people in Wisconsin having to go out and vote yesterday.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Right.
The conservative state Supreme Court in Wisconsin wouldn't allow the governor to delay the primary.
Right. That's ridiculous. Absolutely.
So you either suppress the vote or you endanger people for exercising their rights. It shouldn't have to be that kind of a choice.
Right.
And so when I see that sort of thing happening, you know, that's the worst side, where we're thinking only about ourselves or our own power or our own profit at the expense of other human beings who are suffering or potentially suffering. And so that's the worst. And I just, you know, sometimes it makes you angry. Sometimes it makes you incredibly sad to think that our sense of community has so dissolved that this is even a possibility,
Right.
or that kind of thinking is even possible. I suppose it's always been with us throughout time,
Very true.
but it seems to have come to the forefront. And so as a writer, you see both, and you see both kinds of behavior. And, how do you reconcile them? Well, human beings are heroic and fallible.
Yes.
I mean, and I think the poet's obligation, as Shakespeare teaches us, is to write about both kinds of humanity.
Yes.
So I think, I to answer your question, the best and the worst is within us.
True. I like that. I like that a lot. Oh, I like everything how you're putting it. You're just so poetic. It's amazing. So, as a creator and a poet, kind of what is your goal as a whole to uplift the people around you?
Well, I mean, sometimes my poems are not uplifting. Sometimes sort of starkly realistic. But you would hope that even if someone hears or overhears a sad poem, or someone reads something that's starkly truthful about our human condition, that people are still nonetheless happy that they experienced the poem. So I think the uplift comes from recognizing a really good poem when you see it. The French have a term for this, is that they call it jouissance, this sense of this almost elated, orgasmic experience when you witness beautiful art.
Yes.
For the first time. I mean, so I can give you an example of this. I went to a Van Gogh exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City when I was about your age, and the first painting I saw on the wall was a very famous painting of a pair of shoes. And Van Gogh painted this pair of shoes when he was living in Arles, suffering from his own mental illness during one of the great creative periods of his career. And this pair of shoes is so worn that it has a hole in the bottom of the sole of the shoe. And, I knew the history of the painting because I knew that this pair of shoes belonged to an old woman, an old peasant who would go out into the fields around Arles, France, south of France, every day and toil and toil and toil in the fields, but was so poor that she couldn't afford a good pair of shoes, right? So when I looked at that pair of shoes, you're looking at a kind of metaphor for a difficult life.
Right.
But it's so beautifully rendered, and you see it. And when you see the way that Van Gogh creates this pair of shoes and layers the oil and focuses on the hole in the sole of the shoe, I mean, you realize that the painting is not just about a pair of shoes. It's about a human story.
Right.
A human being who inhabits that pair of shoes. And so it's kind of difficult to see, but by gosh, I'm so grateful that the artist paid attention to show me this pair of shoes, to show me a daily object that I would not have paid attention to.
Right.
Had the artist not called it to my attention.
Right.
And so when I think about the poet's obligation, I think sometimes the poet has an obligation to call attention to both the beautiful and the ugly in our life.
Of course, yes.
With the idea that the very act of calling attention can be uplifting and beautiful in itself.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
How does that sound?
That was really, really good. You made me think a little bit right there. I was just like, wow, actually, you're right. Because now that I put that into my own, profession with writing, like I kind of had that same thought every time that I'm writing an article, no matter what it be about. So I definitely agree.
Yeah. So I kind of forgotten the question. Sometimes I ask way of just.
You're good. You're good. You're on a roll. I love it. You're inspiring us.
So, so there you go.
Yeah. So do you have any words of advice or wisdom that you would like to pass on to the people during a time like this?
Oh boy. Well, I think my first advice would be to follow the advice of the experts and not a poet like myself.
True, true.
You know, pay attention, be mindful, you know, adhere to the demands of social distancing and protect yourself and the people in your community as much as you can. And instead of seeing this time as a kind of imprisonment or confinement,
Yes.
make that confinement something dignified. You know, I mean, as Martin Luther King says, you know, when he's imprisoned in his Birmingham jail cell, you know, what can one do when one has so much time on one's hands except read and think long thoughts and write long letters, you know?
Right.
So in some ways he's, you know, turning that moment of confinement into something absolutely precious and beautiful. And so I think it depends on how you look at the pandemic.
Yes.
You can see it as a kind of moment where this is just a moment of abject, you know, suffering and obstacle, or you can say, well, I'm going to look at this moment as a moment of opportunity,
Right.
so that I can see a different side of my life that may be meaningful. So, you know, it's funny, I'm kind of echoing Albert Camus' novel, The Plague.
Okay.
Composed in 1947 about a
Wow.
pandemic afflicting a city in Algeria.
Okay.
And in so many ways, everything that Camus wrote about in 1947 is happening right now. So if you really kind of want to think about how to think about this pandemic, maybe go read Camus' beautiful novel, The Plague.
Okay.
Yeah, it's wonderful book. And, you know, a doctor is on the front lines trying to warn the general population about the coming catastrophe, and nobody's paying attention. And then
Yeah.
as soon as people are quarantined, they're complaining and they're
Right.
so absorbed. And then as the novel goes on, people begin to come together and there's community, and the heroism of people struggling against death really comes to the forefront. So I guess that's my best advice. So,
I like it.
you know, pay attention to the doctors
Yes.
and the good people who are trying to help us through this and who
Yes.
know.
Right.
And as those people are helping us, help yourself by thinking about a good perspective that will enable you to get through it in a good way, in a positive way.
And it's a good book recommendation too, because as we all know, history always ends up repeating itself. So it's always good to look out on the past, because we all know that sometime in the future it's going to end up happening again. So it's always good to educate yourselves.
Yeah. And you know, my second moment of advice is to, you know, even as we may feel a little bit inconvenienced about being quarantined,
Yes.
many other people are way more inconvenienced. I mean, think about the people who have lost loved ones,
Right.
who have had to share their last words via iPhone,
Right. Exactly.
or some other form of social media. And then the inability of family members to come together to be able to grieve.
Right. Exactly. That too.
Yeah, that's a kind of social distancing that's incredibly difficult, far more difficult than the kind
Right.
of.
Exactly. So we should also be, very grateful for the position that we are in,
Right.
because there's always going to be someone that's worse off.
Yeah, that's right. So,
Nice.
anyway,
Nice words of wisdom and advice right there. I like
not to proselytize at all, but
it. So that's pretty much all I have for questions for you. So that was really, really intellectual. I love that so much. Like, that was one of the best interviews thus far. So thank you so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it.
It was amazing.
I
You
hope
made
some
me
people
think
like
more than
that.
anything. I'm just like over here like, wow, I'm just stuck in thought. So why don't you go ahead and read us your poem that you prepared for us for your show?
Okay. Well, I mentioned to you that I woke up one morning and, I was actually awakened by a siren. And there's a local community fire department, right
Okay.
up the road. And I was awakened by that siren early in the morning. And if you recall, I don't know if you've read Homer's Odyssey at all, but there are some characters in that book named the Sirens, who are these three beautiful women who lure men to their deaths by singing
Yes.
beautiful songs. And Odysseus escapes that fate by having his crew lash him to the mast of Calypso and stop her. He has them stop her their ears with beeswax, and so that the ship can sail on by. But Odysseus is the only mortal who's ever been privileged to hear the siren's song and live to talk about it,
Yes.
So the sirens are luring human beings and sailors to their death. They dash these sailors on the rocks. So there are bits of allusions to that text, but of course the sirens are sounding now more than ever in New York City and in our urban areas. And every time you hear a siren calling, you realize that another human being is struggling mightily.
Yes.
And oftentimes undergoing very difficult circumstances. So this is not a particularly uplifting poem, but I'm calling attention to the prevalence of what's happening in New York City, for example. Okay, so it's called The Sirens of April.
Okay.
The sirens are calling men to their death. This time, the women too. Through the empty streets, the sirens call. In the rain, the sirens call. The sirens call on balmy days when the cherries toss their confetti to the wind. At night, the sirens call. The sirens call from the tugboats. The sirens call to the shuttered shops on Broadway and Fifth. The sirens call. Past the Upper West Side, down the Lower East Side, from Brooklyn, the sirens call. The sirens call from Queens, from Staten Island and the Bronx, across the Hudson from Jersey, the sirens call. The sirens never tire. From their perches on trucks and spires, the sirens call. The alluring, pitiless sirens call. By your neighbor walking her dog, the sirens call. To the boys in the park, the invincible boys, the sirens call and call. The sirens call the starlings to flock. To the rooftops and rivers, the sirens call. The sirens call, the sirens call. The beautiful to their drowning, the sirens call. Yeah, that's it.
That was so good. Oh my goodness. Yes. I love that.
Yeah. So
That was really, really good. It makes you really think. And I like the perspective that you put towards that a lot.
yeah.
Now,
So,
every time I hear a siren, I'll definitely think about that.
well, it's, it's interesting because we hear them all the time, but this time makes us pay attention to them more than ever.
Exactly.
So the great thing about it, I posted this poem on Facebook, and one of our great contemporary novelists, an African-American writer named Ishmael Reed, contacted me and said, "Hey, this is a great poem. I want to publish this in my journal." So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
well, congrats.
it never happens that way.
Right.
I mean, you mostly send things out and
Right.
toss your rejection letters in the
Exactly. Yeah. True.
and, every now and then you get lucky. So that's what happened. So
Nice.
it's a tough poem, but at the same time, these are beautiful people who are, not going to be with us.
Exactly. So we have to remember them, and that sometimes you have to think about the worst before things can get better. So
no, that's right. So I hope, even though that it's maybe not an uplifting poem, it's at least gratifying poem.
exactly, it definitely resonates in the soul, the heart, and definitely the mind as well. So
yeah. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on my show. I appreciate you so much. This was a great interview, like so great.
Thank you so much, for sharing my thoughts and allowing me the forum. I hope some people feel a little bit better after hearing our discussion.
Yes, I hope so too. I hope they all took this to the heart and the soul and really have their minds working and processing everything that they heard tonight.
Yeah. And I know that's part of your goal. I mean, is to, hey, this is how we come together. Let's use art as a means for understanding ourselves, for coping, for helping us get through this issue. So
exactly, it's always good to take a break, and art is one of the most beautiful ways to do it. So
it absolutely is.
So do you have your works anywhere that anyone can view them, or?
I do have a book of poetry published called Counting Thunder.
Okay.
You can just go on Amazon and get it there. You can go to the Poetry Foundation. I have some poems in Poetry Magazine and other journals. So if you just do a Google search, you'll be able to find me.
Okay.
I usually use my middle name, Robert Bernard Haas.
Okay.
To distinguish myself from the poet laureate who spells his name exactly the same way.
Right. Got to distinguish yourself.
Who stole my name 20 years before I was born. So,
gosh darn him.
Yeah, I know. So I'm Robert Haas the Younger.
Yes, there we go. Yes.
But
perfect.
So, yeah.
Awesome.
So, well, great to speak with you.
Yes, definitely nice to meet you. Nice to learn so much more about you. And thank you so much for making us all think a little bit more about this pandemic and both the negative and the positive aspects of it. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, it's with us. I mean, I'm not the only one who has these insights, obviously.
Right.
I think we're all thinking that.
But it's always good to get everyone's personal insight for sure, because we're all going to have different volumes and levels to it. So
maybe there are just a lot of people who are overhearing what we're saying, who are thinking the same things for themselves.
Right.
Well,
hear it some more. Take it in, people.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to send you off. Thank you again so much. I hope you have a great night, and I hope you stay safe out there and just keep doing what you're doing and inspiring the people.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it, and keep in touch and keep up the great work. Okay.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take
All
care.
right. Bye. Bye. All right, guys. So wasn't that a great episode? Like, I'm so inspired. Like, I feel like I could cry right now. He had so many beautiful words to give us. So I really hope that you guys took everything that he said to heart and soul, because I know I most certainly did. Even that poem was incredible. Even though it was kind of a downer, it really makes you feel that much more uplifted for the spot that we're in. So, if you guys are ever having a hard time dealing with the social distancing, I know personally myself, today was kind of a rough day for me. I really wasn't feeling so hot when I woke up, really was feeling the loneliness factor of being here, but talking to him makes me realize that at the end of the day, there's people that are a lot worse off, and there's people that are losing their lives here every day to something like this. So I'm glad that I can at least offer this venue to all of you guys to try and take your minds off of it, and give you guys some insight on what you can do to make the time pass a little bit faster. So I thank you guys all so much for coming in. Thank you, Robert Haas, so much for all of your words of wisdom, advice, and inspiration. And like I said, this is Simone. I'll be back tomorrow for Tales Behind the Creative. Tomorrow's going to be episode number 8. I'm going to have my newly found friend Will Sofa on. He's a local musician, poet, and he's done a lot of work in the journalist field. He's had interviews, given interviews, so it should be a really good time. The first time I ran up on him was at an open mic night at my friend Marlene's house, and I did a pretty interesting freestyle there on the mic, and he fell in love with me from that. So who knows what happens in the interview tomorrow. It should be an interesting one. So this is just me signing off. I'm sorry I'm like in an emotional state right now. It was just such a great interview. Oh my goodness. But I'm Simone, your hostess with the Samostis, and this was Tales Behind the Creative. We'll be back tomorrow, like I said, at 8 o'clock on the dot with Will Sofa. So you guys tune in. Until then, you guys have a beautiful night. Have a beautiful day tomorrow. Let's just keep pushing through this. The days are going by faster than I would have thought, so I hope they're doing the same for you. Earlier, I just forgot to mention earlier, the intro was Josh Prine. He has just recently passed from the COVID-19 pandemic. He had got the virus and passed away, so that was a nice little tribute that I was able to give to him, even though I don't own the rights to the music. But I'm glad that we could send off that tribute to him, because there's a lot of people that are dying in the artistic world, and it's always good to give a little send off in the most positive light that we can. So other than that, though, again, this is me signing off, Symoné Crockett. This is Tales Behind the Creatives. I love you all so much. Thank you so much for tuning in and giving me all the continued support that you continue to lend to me. So I love you guys. Have a good night. Be safe, and I'll see you again tomorrow, okay? Bye.